What's going on YouTube? In today's video I'm going to show you how you can build this GUI or Graphical User Interface that uses the NASA APOD API and displays the astronomy picture of the day. Okay, so what we are doing in this project is we are using the API provided by this website, api.nasa.gov. And if we go down the browse APIs, specifically we're using the one for the APOD or astronomy picture of the day. And what that is going to do is return an image along with a number of other things. If we click into an example here, we're using the endpoint and we're getting back a JSON response. And the ones that we're particularly interested in is the HD URL, and this is going to give us our image of the day that we're going to display on our GUI. And you can see it takes some time to load because it's an HD image. But we're going to use that. We're going to also display the title here. We're going to display the explanation along with the image, and then of course the date. And then within our project we're going to use two libraries. One of them is the JSON data bind library, and this is going to help us parse the JSON response from our API. This is an example of JSON response here into a Java object. And the other one we're going to use is a library by Square called OkHTTP. And this is an HTTP client, and it's going to help us create a request body to send a GET request to the NASA APOD API and also create a response. Okay, so we're in IntelliJ, and the first thing that we want to do is create a new project. So we'll click on New Project. Let me expand this out, and we're going to call this, let's say, our APOD app. This is going to use Java, and we're going to use Maven. And the JDK, you're going to want to choose the JDK that you have installed on your system, and then we'll go ahead and click Create. Okay, so now that we have our project structure, let's go over here on the left and find our POM XML file, this file here. And we're going to want to open that. And in here, we're going to add two dependencies. And to get these dependencies, you can go to, let's see, the Maven repository. And you want to search for OkHTTP. And the way I do it is I look for kind of the most recent version, or one that's used a lot, like 4.10 here. Click on that, and then you're going to want to copy this code here and go back to your project. So under version here, you'll want to do a dependencies opening tag and closing tag, and then within those is where you'll place your dependency that you just copied for OkHTTP. And don't worry about the red squigglies right now. And the next thing that you'll want to do is add in the dependency for JSON. So the same thing, we'll go to our Maven repository, we'll type in JSON, and you want to do the JSON data bind. And we'll just use the latest version here. We'll copy this in, go back to our project, and then we'll paste that in under our OkHTTP dependency. All right, let's just clean these spaces up a bit here. And you're getting red squigglies right now, and don't worry about that. That's because what we need to do now is go to our POM XML file here, right click on it, go down to Maven, and then we want to click on Reload Project. And that's going to load our dependencies into our project. You can see the red squigglies are gone. It's doing some indexing, but we should be good to go from this point on, so we can close our POM XML file. Now, the next thing we want to do is add a new class. So we'll click on our package here. We'll do new Java class, and we're going to call this one our APOD. This is called APOD for astronomy picture of the day, and we'll hit enter. And now we're going to want to add in an import statement for JSON. So now here we're showing a JSON response from our NASA APOD API, and it looks like this when it's parsed. And essentially all of these properties here, the copyright date explanation, HD URL, media type, service, version, title, and URL, we're going to want to create fields for all of those within our APOD class. And they're all going to be strings, so let's go ahead and start creating those now. Okay, so I have all of these fields in from our JSON response, and don't worry about these red squigglies that are yelling at us because it's saying that these variables have not been initialized. We're going to do that in the constructor that we're about to create right now. Okay, so in our constructor, we're using our Jackson at JSON property annotation, and it's mapping these JSON properties from our NASA APOD API to these Java field names, which are the field names that we just created up here. So if you don't know what Jackson is a Java JSON library, and what Jackson does is it serializes or deserializes JSON objects into Java objects. Okay, so we're done with our APOD class. Now the next thing we want to do is let's open up our file structure, and we're going to create another class. So we'll do new Java class, and we're going to call this one OkHTTP. And remember, we added OkHTTP to our dependencies, and its job is to create a HTTP request and produce a response body. We're going to want to import a bunch of import statements. So I'll just go ahead and paste those in. Feel free to pause the video and copy those over to your project. And now we're going to want to create a bunch of variables that we're going to use within this class. Okay, so rather than typing out all of these variables, I'm going to just copy and paste them in, and then I'm going to walk through them one by one and explain what each of them are. And we're going to start with our -date count, which is just a variable. We're going to pass in this variable to determine the date that we want to display the information and the APOD image from. And then here we're creating a Jackson object mapper. And what the object mapper does is it's used to serialize or deserialize JSON objects into Java objects. And it's called object mapper because it maps JSON into Java objects. And here we're simply creating an instance of our OkHTTP client, and we're just going to name it client. And here we're creating an instance of a local date time. We're calling it LDT, and we're setting it equal to local date time.now. And what that's going to do is set it equal to the current date and time of your system. And then we're creating another local date time variable called previous date. And this is going to equal our local date time, which is, remember, is the current date. And we're calling -days on it. And now we're passing in our -date count. Currently this variable is set at 0, so it's going to be still the current date time now. But this is how we either increment or decrement from the current date time. We're either going to increment or decrement the -date count, and we're going to pass that in, and that is going to change our date that is stored in the previous date variable. And I'm going to create one for next date as well. And this is going to be tied into our previous and next buttons on our graphical user interface. And the next thing we're doing is we're using our OkHTTP client to build an HTTP request. So we're doing request equals a new request.builder. We pass in the URL, and this is the API endpoint for our NASA APOD. And also here, we need to pass in our API key. For this example, I'm using the public demo key, but I highly suggest that you register and create your own API key. I believe the demo key is limited to 50 requests per day, whereas your own registered API key, you can do up to 1,000 requests per hour. And then we're going to call .build on that. And here on line 24, we've created our request. We now need to use our client to create a new call, and then we pass in the request that we created and we call execute on it. And this is going to come back as a response. So we're storing the response from this request into this response variable. And now finally, we're creating an instance of our APOD class that we created before, and we're setting it equal to our mapper. So we're using our Jackson object mapper. We're calling .read value, and we're passing in our response body, and we want it to be a string, and we're also passing in the class that we want to map the responses to. And that, of course, is our APOD class, where we have all of the variables that we want to map the responses to. And these are yelling at us because we have an unhandled exception. Anytime you're doing a HTTP GET request, you have the chance of throwing an input-output exception, so we need to add that to the constructor. Okay, so we're still within our OkHTTP class, and now we're going to create some getter methods for the 4 JSON properties that we're going to be using in our GUI. And that's going to be our getHD URL. We're just going to return our apod.hd URL. And the same goes, we're going to get the explanation, we're going to get the title, and we're going to get the date. So when we look at our JSON response, when we call the NASA APOD API, we can see that the date format is in year, month, and day. So when we create a request for a different date, we're going to have to pass the date into our request URL using this format. And to do that, we're going to create 2 methods, one to get the formatted previous date, and which will be tied to our previous button, and then of course one to get the formatted next date, which will be tied to our next date button on our GUI. So here I have the method to get the formatted previous date, and I have a placeholder for a parameter to pass in the local date time, the date, and then I'm incrementing the minus date count. And then we're setting our variable from before, our previous date, to equal date.minus days, and now we're passing in our minus date count, which has now been incremented. So in this case, remember, we set it to 0 up here. So when we call this function, right, when we press our previous button, minus date count is going to equal 1, previous date, and it's going to equal date.minus days 1. So it's going to be 1 day from the current local date time. So now we're returning the date time formatter of pattern, and we passed in, remember, the pattern that our API uses, and that's the year, month, and day. And then the second parameter is we have to call a locale on it, and we're simply just calling locale.english for the language. And then we do .format and pass in the date format, which is the previous date here. So now that we have our get format previous date, we want to do the same thing and add in a get formatted next date. So what we can do is just copy this function and just change the title. And instead of incrementing minus date counts, we want to decrement it. So remember, we're decrementing it because, say we're currently at 1. If we click next, we want to go back to the current date, right? And that would be decrementing this to equal 0, right? Because date minus day 0 would equal the current date. So hopefully that makes sense to you and isn't too confusing. Okay, so we've created these 2 methods, and all they're really doing is formatting the date to the correct format so that we can use it as a query on our build URL. So now we need to actually create our methods that is going to create a new request with the new query parameter for the date, and that's going to equal our formatted date that we just created. Okay, so I've just copied in the get previous date data method. And again, we need to throw an IO exception. And we're creating a string called date request. And this is going to equal the API endpoint that we need to call. So it's the same request as earlier. However, now we are adding the date query parameter. You can see here after our API key, we have end date equals, but now we're concatenating the result of our get formatted previous date, right? So we pass in the local date to this function, and the result is going to be a formatted date in the correct format that we concatenate our string date request. And then what we want to do is, again, use our OkHTTP client, create a request, and then we're going to pass in the URL that we just created, date request, and we're going to build that request. Again, we're going to create a response to equal our client call, where we pass in our request, and then we call execute on it. And again, we're using our Jackson object mapper to map that response body to a string, and we're mapping it to the APOD class. And now what I'm doing here is I'm creating a string array. I'm calling it new data of size 4, and I'm setting those equal to the 4 properties that I want out of the JSON. So we've created a getPreviousDate data method, and this method builds a new request for the previous date. So now what we need to do is create one for the next date, right? Because our GUI is going to have previous and next buttons. And to do that, we'll just copy this method and rename it to getNextDate. And the only thing that we need to change in here is instead of calling getFormatedPreviousDate, we need to call getFormatedNextDate. And of course pass in the local date time. Okay, so you can see here that we're reusing some code here, right? We're using our OkHTTP client to create a request and response. So these 4 lines of code are the same here. So this presents us an opportunity to refactor this into its own method. And we can simply call that method here and pass in the either next date or previous date. However, I've tried that route, and for whatever reason, interestingly enough, I found that it seemed to be a bit laggier getting the response when I would click the previous and next buttons on our GUI rather than having it written this way individually within each of these methods. So for now, I'm going to keep this the way that it is. If you would like to refactor this into its own method, please feel free to do so, and let me know in the comments if that works better for you in your GUI. Okay, so that should be it for our OkHTTP class. And the only class that we have next now is going to be for our Graphical User Interface.